Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another exciting UKDEA webinar. Thanks very much for registering to attend. We've had over 200 people register today, and I see people are pouring into the room, the virtual room as we speak. So I'll take things quite slowly this morning to kick us off. So my name is Simon Woodward. I'm the chairman of the UKDEA. I'm sure many of you will know me. If not, hello for the first time. This morning's session is about heat network zoning, strategic heat networks, ideas, visions and challenges. So we put this presentation or this webinar together as a result of a call from a number of our members who wanted to talk about what they saw as sort of ideas, ways that heat network zoning could be used quite creatively, the visions for how they could use heat network zoning, and also the challenges. So that's the nature of the webinar this morning, and I'll start with an introduction and just a bit about some member benefits moving forward. Just in terms of your participation in the event, you'll see that there's a questions button and a chat button in the bottom right hand corner of your screen. If you want to chat to other people and say hello to somebody you haven't seen for years, put it in the chat. If you'd like to ask a question for the speakers, please do so. That goes in the questions section, so you just literally go onto the questions tab and type a question, and that's how that will work. So without further ado, I will move forward with a bit of an introduction to the day. So yeah, we're really excited. We're kicking off very shortly with Arran Mornin. Arran's head of heat network policy for DESNZ, and with a new government in place, it's very exciting to hear what Arran can or cannot tell us about the new government's direction on heat network zoning. So he'll give a consultation overview, so larger historical view of what's happened in terms of the consultation, but hopefully in the questions we can tease out of Arran some thoughts and ideas of how it will be moving forward. Then we move on to Lars Fabricius, Managing Director of SAV. So Lars has got a very stimulating and interesting presentation on how UK can reach net zero using waste heat. Then we've invited two of our legal colleagues into the room, Carrie and Nathan from Bevan, Brittan, and they will be talking about heat network zoning, the legal opportunities and challenges. So a very interesting presentation from a legal perspective. Then we're moving on to Nick from Vital Energy, Chief Strategy Officer. Nick will be talking about, from an ESCO perspective, from a delivery body's perspective, heat network zone development challenges, risks and opportunities. And then we'll finally be wrapping up with Steve Hart from BAXI, Director of Integrated Solutions, and Steve will be talking about using BAXI's modular substations to aid rapid delivery. So a common issue with very rapid delivery of heat networks is how do you do it in terms of the supply chain. So BAXI have developed modular substations to aid that delivery. Then after Steve has spoken, we will go to Q&A. We've allowed 30 minutes. We may need more, we may need less, but we'll see how we get on. So without further ado, I will move on to introducing the UKDEA. So if you haven't come across us before, and I know many of you were on the call, we were started back in 2010, so 14 years ago, by 6 largely local authority members, founder members who wanted to create a voice and a network of an organisation for the heat network sector. All members are equal in their importance, but we do have 4 members at the core. Those are the people who own, essentially they've got money at risk in the game of developing heat networks, and together with the associate members, they make up the full membership of the association. So benefit number 1, why would you consider joining? Well, we've now got well over 160 members. We're the largest voice for district energy in the UK. We're connected to a network of over 500 individuals working in the sector, and we're roughly split 50-50 between people delivering heat networks, so energy services companies, contractors, local authorities, sorry, and consultants, legal advisors and equipment manufacturers. So a good broad spectrum of members, a really good network. So benefit number 2, we issue a monthly journal to all members. It's free, it's all part of your membership, 50-60 pages, and that's a two-way street. It tells you what's going on in the sector, but it also is an opportunity for you to tell members what you're doing in the sector. So it's a shop window, and you can see a number of front covers there of different members who've been in the member spotlight over the last couple of years. We then move on to the website. The website is sort of the knowledge hub for the UKDEA. We've got the library, which contains over 500 documents. Many of them are really hard to get hold of these days. We've also got our historical webinars. We've run a lot of those. and also the members directory, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Member meetings, contacts with DESNZ. We meet regularly with DESNZ, but we can also offer you a member meeting whenever you want. We can talk about what's happening in the sector. If it's in the public domain, it's likely we'll know about it and we can share it. Essentially, it means you don't have to know everything about everything going on in the sector. You can talk to us and we'll give you an update of what's been going on in the journal or emails, etc. And as you can see there, there's a nice little attestation at the bottom from Jodie Pittaway about our approach to heat networks and our work with the government. So member working groups, responses to consultations. We regularly respond to consultations on behalf of the members. We're literally about to submit the one on UKDEA and the use of waste heat and heat networks and how those interact. That's got to be submitted later on this week. And we clearly responded to things like heat network zoning and the off-term consultation. We also have a number of working groups looking at heat network zoning. We've actually got a joint meeting this afternoon on heat network zoning technical issues. We've got working groups on growing the supply chain, counterfactuals and sleeving. So lots of active things to get involved with. Webinars. Today is a webinar. We try where possible to have them CPD certified. We run a number of webinars over the last 2 to 3 years, generally on things to do with particular interest topics for the sector. So we've got heat network zoning today. We've talked about heat pumps. We talked about utilising waste heat, contracts and agreements, ambient loops, role of local authorities and heat networks. Wherever possible, there's a common theme topic, we will run a webinar for members. So in-person events, we run 2 in-person events. One is the UKDEA Pavilion at Future Build, and that was very successful back in March, and we're planning something quite exciting for Future Build again in March 2025. And our own annual conference, we had ours last year at Alexandra Palace, and we're planning hopefully later on this year or early next, the UK's first Heat Network Expo, so that's very exciting. Training register, it's available on our website. We've got 25 members put their courses, some are free, some are paid, in the training register. There's over 100 courses on offer, so it's a place to showcase training that you offer, and that's updated twice per year. We've got a jobs board. We can't offer to or undertake to fill every role that you might have, but it's another free place to put jobs onto the web, and it's a widely searched website, and the jobs board is actively looked at by hundreds of people across the sector. So a good place to advertise jobs. We've got podcasts. We've issued one of those. We're planning to develop the next one shortly. So this is about topical issues within the sector. Number 11, we've got a series of awards at the conference. That's the first awards we awarded back in 2023. And again, we've got a number of people very interested in winning awards in 2024 at our next annual conference. So very exciting. And then the final benefit is one we've recently added and we're working on at the moment, is the UK's first heat network specifiers guide. So this is a guide which will contain the details of what all of the members can offer, all of the products and services featured by the members. And we think it will become the go-to guide for everybody across the sector. And the first edition will be launched in autumn 2024. So we think that's a really exciting initiative, another very interesting benefit for members to take advantage of. So finally, there's the membership fees. We've kept them low from the start as a result of local authorities developing the scheme from the very start. Apologies about the voice. If you'd like to join, do contact me or contact the secretary. We'd be very, very pleased to discuss that. But without further ado, I'll invite the first speaker to come onto the stage. So the first speaker is Mornin. Arran is Head of Heat Network Policy for DESNZ, and he will be talking about the consultation overview. And without further ado, I will leave and let Arran get on with his presentation. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. And yes, good morning, everyone. As Simon said, I'm Arran Mornin, and I lead the Heat Network Zoning Policy team within the Department for Energy, Security and Net Zero. Until February this year, I was leading the whole of the policy team, and that's an opportunity for me to talk about what the different parts of the team do. So, as I said, I lead on the zoning policy, Heat Network zoning policy. For England, will fundamentally transform the scale of the district heating sector within England. But the other half of the team works on heat network regulation and that is under my new colleague Dave Newton, who's recently taken on responsibility for that area, and that is working with Ofgem to ensure that across Great Britain, heat network consumers get better consumer protection regulation, and that is off the back of a 2018 report that the Competition and Markets Authority did into the sector, where it found that on average consumers do get good standards from their heat network, but there is, unfortunately, a significant minority of consumers that do not get good customer service, and the CMA recommended that, considering the government is interested in growing the sector to meet its net zero goals, it has Ofgem regulate the heat network sector to improve those consumer standards. So I just wanted to start with that as a kind of bit of background to the two different areas of policy that we operate for heat networks in the department. Well, it's very good to speak with you all after the election. Obviously, during the pre-election period, civil servants are quite limited in what we can say publicly, but now we have new ministers under a new Labour government. We're able to go out and speak and engage again with the sector, which is really good to be able to speak more openly again. It's overall very encouraging news. We've started to work with our new ministers, so our new Secretary of State Ed Miliband, and our new junior minister will be Mieta Fambola, who is going to be the new junior minister responsible for clean heat. And she is an MP for South London in the area of Camberwell. Already really getting stuck into their portfolios. As a bit of background for those who haven't seen, Mieta Fambola was an economist and someone who's really interested in getting into the detail, and will be really interested and is already asking a lot of questions, about the fantastic opportunity for deployment of heat networks across the country to deliver lower cost heat as we transition towards net zero. They're standing fully behind the previous government's commitment that heat network zoning will be deployed by 2025. And just to go into the history of heat network zoning for a little bit to explain all that. In 2020, the previous Conservative government made its first commitment that by 2025, heat network zoning will be in force across England. And that drew on inspiration from many other countries around the world, which have tried to be developing the heat networks industry in their countries. So countries such as Denmark, where it's very mature and established, or the Netherlands, which is in a similar position to the UK of having relatively low cost gas and lots of individual heating systems, but not much in the way of district heating systems, but also other countries such as France and further afield, such as Korea. So lots of other countries are looking at heat network zoning and deploying it. And England, but also Scotland, through their local heat and energy efficiency strategies, are looking to adopt a zoning policy to encourage heat networks. And so we'll skip on to what is zoning. So today I'll be talking. Unfortunately, I can't give too much information on policy development for heat network zoning under the new government. We intend to publish a government response to our consultation, which we published in December last year. We intend to publish that government response this autumn, which will give our response to everyone's input in response to that consultation, and show the direction of travel and how we intend heat network zoning policy to operate once it goes live next year. And of course, as always, it's an enormous thank you to everyone who contributed to that consultation. And I appreciate it's an enormous amount of work to write all those responses and get all of the companies to consider their views about the various different policy issues that we raised in that consultation. And during the pre-election period, the policy team that I lead has been busy reading through all of them, considering them, collating views, and considering our next steps for zoning policy. So it's a big thank you there as well. And for those who are not so familiar with heat network zoning, what is it? What has Arran been talking about? Heat network zoning across England will designate areas where heat networks are going to be the lowest cost way of decarbonising the space heating and hot water demands of buildings. And it will then enable local governments in those areas to designate areas where the buildings will be zoned and where a zone will be designated. And within those heat network zones, certain types of buildings will be required to connect to the district heat network. And in addition, recoverable heat sources will also be required to connect if they're situated in or around the zone. And those heat sources are things like data centers or water treatment works or waste incinerators, where they could be providing low cost and low carbon heat to the district heat network. And local government, supported by a central zoning authority within central government, will be supported to then run a competitive appointment process to select a district heat network developer, who will then be taking forward the responsibility for developing the infrastructure within the zone and triggering the requirement to connect on certain buildings within those zones. And the aim of heat network zoning is to fundamentally transform the scale of the district heat network sector in this country, and tackling the market failure of the coordination problem in trying to develop really large-scale heat networks. In the years building up to the commitment in 2020, we were hearing a lot from the sector that trying to develop a district heat network in England is often incredibly difficult for a number of reasons. But one of the main reasons is, that was presented to us, was that it's very difficult to consider a district heat network at scale if you are not certain that, if you're not confident that the sufficient number of buildings within the zone are actually going to connect within the time frame that you need them to. It's a kind of chicken and egg scenario that you can't build to the scale if you're not sure that you're going to get sufficient buildings to connect, and the buildings are not going to connect if you can't demonstrate you're actually going to build and get close to those buildings. So heat network zoning, making sure that there are designated areas, that there are going to be exclusive developers of the district heat network within those areas, that buildings are going to be required to connect by law within those areas, will resolve those problems and try and get us to developing district heat networks at the city and town-wide scale that we so often see in other continental European countries, but that we don't have commonly in England. And that is all to ensure that we develop low carbon heat networks as we transition to net zero, and that we reduce the cost of that transition to net zero, because we know that district heat networks can deliver heat more cheaply than other low carbon technologies such as air source heat pumps, and that they can provide enormous savings to the electricity grid as we need to transition to electrifying heating, because they can use that electrical input far more efficiently than individual air source heat pumps. And to get into the detail of our proposals in a little bit more detail, we set out in our consultation how there will be a national zoning model built and operated by the Central Zoning Authority, operated and distributed by a team within central government. And I'm sure you'll all be encouraged to know that during the pre-election period, that modelling team has continued to be extremely busy, building and refining that model, ready for deployment either later this year or early in 2025, to ensure that a national map can be presented to local areas, and that those local areas and local governments can be encouraged to discover areas of their towns or cities which are going to be really suitable for deployment of low carbon heat networks. And to go into a bit more detail about that model, the model is being tested with kind of 28 towns and cities across the country to ensure that that we're learning a lot about the particularities of local environments to refine that model and ensure that it's going to be presenting the best possible outputs that it can be. And I'm just going to pause on this slide then to kind of go into a bit more detail and run through a bit more about exactly what it is that we presented in our consultation. But before I do that, maybe I'll just go into a bit more kind of wider context about what's happened since the election, and what can I share. So, I mean, the first thing is just to pick up on something that Simon mentioned at the beginning of his presentation, which was just before the election. I think actually on the day that it was all called, our colleagues in the UK emissions trading scheme managed to publish their consultation on potential reforms to the UK ETS, and specifically talked about the application of the UK ETS to the district heating sector, and whether it could incentivize the greater connection of energy from waste plants to heat networks. And we know that energy from waste plants are an incredibly important heat source for many heat networks. Lots of district heat networks across the country are either are already connected to energy from waste plants or are considering it, and that's because making use of the waste heat from waste incineration is accepted by government as a low carbon source of heat, because that heat would otherwise go to waste, and because often that heat can be provided at relatively high temperatures, which in some circumstances can be beneficial for the heat network and for connections to the buildings, and also because often, though not always, that heat can be relatively inexpensive compared to high temperature heat provided by other low carbon heat sources. So I just wanted to really plug that the emissions trading scheme consultation. For those who haven't considered responding to it, please do, either individually or, as I'm sure Simon would say, by coordinating through the UKDEA. The other thing I would say is, even if you're not interested in the UK ETS from the perspective of encouraging energy from waste connection, please do submit a response anyway if you're interested in the application of the UK ETS to the district heat network sector, because that UK ETS team is interested in hearing as well about any other reforms they can make to make the policy work better for the district heat network sector. So if you're interested in, for example, the threshold at which the UK ETS applies to heat networks in this country, which is 20 megawatts of total installed capacity, and whether that is a good model going forward, please do just pitch in a response anyway on that topic to let the UK ETS team know about that. And then that will inform their kind of prioritization of policy reforms going forward, and what steps they can take to reform the UK ETS as the new government gets to grips with what it wants from that policy area. So hopefully that's just a useful plug on that particular policy. But back to heat network zoning, since the election and since the appointment of the new Labour government as well, the heat network zoning programme has been really getting going with its external engagement, and in particular on our advanced zoning programme, which is working with 19 towns and cities across England to really try and get them ready for heat network zoning going live in 2025. Working with them, ensuring that they are committing at a local government level, at a senior level, to working with the department on heat network zoning, trying to prioritise certain areas for government support to encourage the planning and commercialisation of heat networks within the AZP advanced zoning programme areas, and that will ensure that when the final stages of legislation go live next year for heat network zoning, that there are a good number of towns and cities who are ready to press go, starting to designate zones if they haven't done so already, and appointing private sector heat network developers for the development of district heat networks in their areas. And in addition, from the policy team side, we've already had initial chats. We had chats with Simon and the UK and the ADE yesterday about starting to discuss some of the upcoming issues for our heat network zoning government response, and we're planning a number of public engagement events for early August on the heat network zoning policy. So please keep your eyes peeled and ears attuned for any announcements on that. And I'm sure the UKDEA will be distributing information about them as we announce them. And those will be events where we'll start to share in a bit more detail some of the things that we're working through in terms of designing the heat network zoning policy, and the really big ticket issues that we know we need to reach decisions on for heat network zoning. And that will then inform later this year, when we plan to introduce to Parliament our final statutory instruments, which will be the final bits of legislation that will put heat network zoning into force, and that then will bring it into law in 2025 to get the powers necessary for example, the establishment of zones by local government. And in addition to those, that kind of big scale policy development, hopefully you'll all have seen as well through advertisement from the UKDEA that we're also working with yourselves and trade associations on a number of other technical areas in relation to heat network zoning. And please do sign up if you're interested in discussing or contributing to the establishment of policy in any of those more technical working areas. For example, those areas would be exactly how do we define large non-domestic buildings with wet heating systems within the legislation that should be required to connect to heat networks within zones. Within the consultation, we presented a number of different options for how we could define them, but obviously we now need to make a decision about how exactly that will be defined in legislation. Please do get involved in discussing that or any of the other technical policy areas that we want to work with yourselves on as members of the trade association. And those were the kind of more high-level things. I mean, just to get into a bit more detail about exactly how heat network zoning will work and how we presented it within the consultation. So, a couple of areas that I haven't spoken about so far would be the zone delivery models. Just hopefully to refresh everyone's memory, zone delivery was the process we termed for how local government working as a zone coordinator will decide who will be the heat network developer for that particular area. And as we spoke about in the consultation, there will be a competitive process whereby, in effect, the local government zone coordinator will accept bids from different district heat network developers who will make bids on a number of different variables for how they should be selected to develop the heat network zone. And as we said in the consultation, we want that competitive process to be judged on aspects like experience of developing district heat networks, the evidence of the team that you can bring to the district heat network development. And we're keen that that competitive appointment process does not require the detailed development of district heat network plans for the zone, because we've learned from experience that for a number of other towns or cities across the UK where that's happened, that lots of money is poured into developing detailed technical drawings of how the heat network should be developed by a number of companies to try and win the rights to a zone. But often that can be extremely expensive, and unfortunately there can only ever be one winner for that particular area or zone. And for those who aren't successful at that stage, it's an enormous cost to have done all that detailed project design before someone is appointed. And so we want to make sure that we're not requiring really detailed technical design at that early stage of trying to decide who should be the district heat network developer. We want relatively we want information on the capability of the district heat network developer to be the thing that decides who is appointed. And then that will then, as we spoke about in the consultation, we presented 7 different delivery models for how the local government zone coordinator could then work with the private sector heat network developer, from an option of no consent at all, whereby there would be almost no control by the zone coordinator over how the district heat network developer develops within the zone. We talked about a consent agreement whereby the local government zone coordinator would set out at a relatively high level its ambitions for how the heat network should develop within the zone. And we also presented a number of other more technical options, such as different versions of a concession agreement or a local authority joint venture. And in total, we presented 7 different delivery models and invited feedback and response on which we should allow for the development of heat network zones, mindful of the fact that we don't want too many different potential delivery models. If we end up in a situation where there are a large number of different options for both local government and the sector to engage with, we think that would be definitely suboptimal and lead to a lot of administrative costs for people trying to get their heads around lots of different options for how to develop a heat network within a zone. We also set out in the consultation our approach to incumbent networks, for those of you who are interested in how your current heat network would be treated if it's designated within a zone. And we set out that if there is a district heat network within a zone that is designated, if it is already there, or if you have substantively commercialized plans to expand that district heat network within a zone, that pre-existing investment, would be respected, and that you would get rights to connect buildings within a narrowly defined area around that pre-existing district heat network or area where you'd already substantively commercialized it, to ensure that you can continue to build out, although you would not be automatically given the rights to the entire zone without some form of further competition. And that's to ensure that we respect pre-existing investment, we don't stymie the investment in the sector before zoning goes live, but we also ensure that there's a competitive appointment process for many zones. Finally, just before I finish as well, talking about the interactions with Ofgem and the wider heat network regulation regime. So as I spoke about at the beginning, our plan is that there will be a consumer protection regime operated by Ofgem across Great Britain, who will be introducing consumer protection regulation for domestic consumers of heat networks and micro business consumers of heat networks, and that will require that heat networks meet certain minimum consumer standards, things like responding to unplanned outages within set timeframes and correcting them, or being required to pay statutorily set compensation amounts, ensuring that contracts with consumers contain certain basic information, such as the price that's planned to be charged in a transparent manner set out to consumers, and that GB consumer protection regulation will operate in tandem with the deployment of heat network zones, and in many ways will support it, because we know that many local authorities will not sign up to developing heat network zones in their areas if they cannot be confident that domestic and micro business consumers will not get good standards. And so we really see that Ofgem regulation and introduction of consumer protection regulation as really supporting the development of heat network zoning. And it will ensure as well that there are good standards for contractual transparency and consumer protection that will then be adopted by the district heat networks, and hopefully deployed as well for the small and medium businesses and larger businesses that are connected to heat networks within the zones, ensuring that we get good standards across the sector for all the people and businesses connected to those district heat networks, not just the domestic and micro business consumer ones. So hopefully that's been a useful, refresh of heat network zoning from the perspective of what we set out in the consultation, and at least some information about what's coming down the track from government. The final thing before, Simon, you used the shepherd's crook to pull me off, is to flag the upcoming spending review. So for those who aren't very familiar with government processes, spending review is a multi-year operation to look at government spending across the board and decide where the government wants to reallocate, where it wants to boost spending in certain areas or withdraw spending in certain areas. And we have not, been told yet exactly how many years that spending review will look over. But as you've all seen in the media reports, it is very likely to come up and be started within the coming months. And that will affect heat networks operations and the kind of the support the government gives to the sector. Many of you will be aware that we have a multi-million-pound investment program through the Green Heat Network Fund, as well as another scheme, the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme, which it pays to improve the operation of heat networks. We fully expect to do even better in our allocation for heat networks in this upcoming spending round. The government has talked about its added ambition compared to the previous government for spending on net zero buildings. But for those who, in this sector have opportunities to, make a noise about the importance of the sector, if you have ideas about exactly where that spending should go, that now is the opportunity to start to feed ideas through Simon or take your own opportunities to influence ministers or political figures about, the priorities you think that the government should take into account in deciding its spending priorities for the upcoming years. So I just wanted to also flag the importance of that spending review as and when it gets announced. So I'll be quiet now. I think I've reached time.
There was a question from people about whether you had any more slides because the slides weren't moving, but I think you decided to pause on a slide. And
I did, yes. So there we go. I think that's me. Thanks very much, everyone, for listening. Hope that's been useful.
Very useful. Thanks very much indeed, Arran. Much appreciated. If you can stay online, drop off the stage and bring you back for the Q&A at the end. There's some questions already in the chat, in the questions section as well. So I'll leave you to look at those. So thanks very much, Arran. I'll ask you to leave. So now over to Lars Fabricius. Lars, if I could invite you to join the stage, and Tom pull Arran's slides down. And I will let Lars kick off and talk about how the UK can reach net zero without using waste heat. So thanks very much, Lars.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I am Danish, but lived in England most of my life, so I'm a Danglish. So I've got basically an insight into what's going on in the UK and in Denmark. So this is sort of somewhere in the North Sea that I'm talking. Weathering net zero. There's an old Danish joke that everyone talks about the weather, but no one does anything about it. And I think the issue here is what is net zero? What does, everyone talks about it, but what does it actually mean? We can understand the goal that we don't want to use carbon, but in practice, what is the strategy? Where are we going? And essentially, our whole future depends on us somehow harvesting all of our energy needs from the British weather. And you can sort of say, well, we've seen programs with Jeremy Clarkson doing that, but in essence, our whole livelihood, our industry has got to be harvesting and running off our weather. And if we can't do that well, that's going to have profound implications to our economy. But it's just such a staggering task that we're looking at. But we've got to really grasp the fact that it's the British weather that's going to make us energy independent. But my God, it's unpredictable, and how are we going to do this? And if you look at a farmer and how a farmer works, a farmer doesn't say, I'm going to go on holiday the first week of August. It's basically the weather is going to tell him when he can go on holiday, but he needs to get up very early every morning and it's graft all day long. So it's a business. It's absolutely a business. It's a business. So really getting to net zero it's a business challenge for the UK. How are we going to do this? Because we can't, and you can't run a farm with a lot of waste. You can't sort of say, I'm only going to harvest half of my crop, or I'm only going to use half a pig. What I can't sell to one hand, I'm going to stuff into sausages and sell them to someone else. A business is a business, but net zero basically means we somehow got to make do with our weather and at the same time maintain our livelihood. And I was at this conference in Denmark some years ago, and they were talking about, ethanol and so forth, and Maersk Line, big Danish container company, and Maersk had sort of announced to the market that it was going to build, I think, 8 massive sort of container ships, and they're going to come online in the mid 2030s, and it could basically run on ethanol because their clients are wanting to have green transport and so forth. But then when the Danes started to calculate how much wind power would be required to produce the energy for these Maersk ships, then they started to realize that something like 90% of the whole installed wind power of Denmark would be needed to run these. But Maersk doesn't have 8 container ships; they've got 300 container ships. And Denmark's got lots of wind, and the wind industry is based there and so. So what about Maersk's other 300 ships and all the rest of heavy transport, not to talk about aviation and so forth? So that the scale of the task is absolutely staggering. I don't think anyone, there's probably some intelligent person somewhere that can fathom it, but I think most of us simply can't fathom how converting to this plentiful fossil fuels, 300 million years in the making, how are we going to replace that with the British weather? I'm really keen to understand how we do that. And coming back to this farming analogy, in Denmark, the Danish DNA is very closely linked to the land. And what's going on in Denmark is that they've realized that originally they did local schemes, and local schemes was sort of a little bit like we're talking about with zoning, and then we have houses and so forth, and they started to connect them to local power stations. But they're now they can realize that if we're going to get Denmark to net zero, we're basically having to develop our whole heat infrastructure akin to the way the power infrastructure and gas infrastructure works. So this is an area that the actual size of this is the triangle region of Denmark. So it's in the middle of Denmark, and there's we're talking 5-6 cities, towns, cities, and what they're doing is the red line is basically heat highways or heat transmission lines that are going and gathering waste heat from different sources and supplying to the cities in that area, and that's being expanded across land by probably around 90, 100 miles a year. But the interesting thing in their structure is that it's local authorities doing the local demand side, but they've created, these local authorities have joined into a supply company. So they have one transmission company that is tasked on going out and sourcing cheap heat. And in practice, that means waste heat from wherever they can find it. And so therefore, very much in a farming mentality, they're out looking for cheap heat, because with cheap heat, you can make money and so forth. And that's exactly what's going on, this expansion. But again, when you visit these Danish district heating schemes, it feels as if you're on a farm. So they are instinctively farmers. They don't have barns, they have thermal stores. They don't have tractors. They have solar panels, CHPs. They have a myriad of things, because depending on what's going on with the weather patterns, they're basically going to harvest. So when there is a front coming through, there's going to be a lot of power on the grid. The power is going to be cheap because they can't get rid of it, and it's going to be low carbon. So it's all about taking that power off the grid, storing it in their thermal barns, and then supplying it into the city. So it's very much a farming mentality that the Danes have been forced to do. It's something they instinctively have done, but it's the necessity of net zero. And this is a scheme that's in development. This is East Lothian, so you've got Edinburgh to the left, and as it turns out, there's a lot of waste heat not knocking around in Edinburgh, but beyond Edinburgh, in places like Dunbar, waste incineration. They've got old power stations that have been pulled down along the coast and so forth. So you could say it's basically, 30 miles from the waste, free basically waste, very cheap waste, into Edinburgh. And so this is one of our sort of reflections that our criticism, I suppose, of the zoning is that the zoning is very urban centric, it's very building centric. But net zero is a huge challenge, not just for the buildings, but also for industry. And industry is going to be consuming huge amounts of our renewables, but industry also produce in large amounts of waste heat. They can't optimize all their processes and have zero waste heat. So from data centers to waste incineration to power stations, there's so much waste heat. And so you've got to look at it not at a zoning level, which is street by street, local authority level. You've got to look at it at a regional level. And this is the missing link But if you spoke to the gas utilities, the power utilities, they would say exactly that. When power started back in the day, there would be local power generation in the cities. They've gone way beyond that and created transmission lines across country. And it was interesting, we were engaging with East Lothian and they were asking the question, yeah, but can we really transport heat over distance? And then the question they were raising is, how much would our heat loss be pumping waste heat from Dunbar into Edinburgh? And the answer was, it was a Danish consultancy say, you would actually not lose any heat. And then people say, how can you not lose any heat transporting over that distance? And say, well, perhaps half a degree, but then you've also got the waste heat from the pump that's pumping to Edinburgh, so that will take you back. So actually just doing and thinking regional, the danger I see with the zoning is it's forcing local authorities who have no experience in heat networks devising local schemes. But when you start thinking in these terms, you've got to think actually the energy centers of heat networks should not be stuck in Hyde Park. They should be beyond that, in where we've always put industry in industrial areas, and then you put mega huge thermal stores in those areas. So it's a holistic view, but going into cities to create our heat is why would we do that when we've got so much waste heat beyond, and industry needs to get rid of its heat to actually improve their carbon credentials. So looking at and in isolation is and this is the if you ask the farmer, how do you set about a task? You set about a task by defining the problem, and the solutions and the problems are just two sides of the same coin. The problem is that net zero requires industry and our homes to all get to net zero. So you can't look at anything in isolation. And therefore industry, and if you're going to get the heat from industry to the cities, it's heat transmission lines. But heat transmission lines, or heat highways as we phrase them, has not been discussed in any of the documents. That's like some other department. But it's how you're going to do this, how's this going to work? Which leads to my sort of final slide, and that is that the challenge that we see is that what happened in Denmark, the Danes, there is a business sort of expression that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So we can have a strategy that tells us this is how we're going to get to net zero. That's great. But the problem that we see is that we as a nation are completely gas addicted. We basically, cheap gas has made us lethargic, lazy. We can't see beyond that. We're still looking for someone to come in and solve our energy, because we've never had to worry about our energy. It's always been easy. Someone else has made some decisions and that's going to take care of everything. But the truth is we've got to actually get that energy out of our climate, and therefore it requires us getting up very early like the farmers do. And there's a huge amount of grafting, but we're still sitting, I think, somehow thinking there's going to be an easy way to net zero, and there won't be. It's at the same time, it's not negative, because it's a tremendous opportunity for the UK. UK's got plentiful sort of natural resources, but exploiting them as opposed to saying net zero is a chore, it's quite the opposite. It's the opportunity, but it's going to require a dramatic change. And if I go back to Denmark, knocked the Danes for six was when OPEC said back in the 70s, we might not have enough oil to go around this winter. And that forced the Danes took that literally, as they would do. And then they said, we've got to do something. We can't be dependent on OPEC. We are today dependent on OPEC and the sort of Norwegian gas coming in and so forth. So what's the shock treatment? You know, maybe the Labour government is going to be part of that shock that's going to create a culture change. But if you imagine Yorkshire is the size of Denmark, that if you told Yorkshire, listen, Yorkshire, there's not going to be gas enough to go around this winter, you might going to freeze, then I'll tell you the Yorkshiremen are going to quickly start thinking, well, what about all the waste heat from Drax? Shouldn't we start digging trenches and start bringing that? But a shock to Yorkshire would maybe be the kickstart that's needed in Yorkshire. But what is the kickstart? Because webinaring ourselves to net zero, that's going to happen. How are we going to change a culture change that's going to sort of get us like the farmers and start working really hand in hand with our British culture? But that doesn't happen in the cities. We've got to go beyond the cities. But right now we're in this building focus, building bubble, but it's all industry, our whole country needs to get to net zero. So that's my concern, that a fundamental cultural change and business attitude to getting to net zero is what we're missing.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. No, thanks very much indeed, Lars. Much appreciated.
Pleasure.
I'm sure there'll be a number of questions following. Just in support of Lars, there was actually a study done by the Institute of Civil Engineers, a very respected body, a few years ago, and that actually proved that there's enough heat wasted in the UK each year to heat all of our homes and businesses, if only we could connect the waste heat producers with our homes. So agree with Lars. Anyway, thanks very much indeed, Lars. If I mind you to ask you to step off the stage, and we'll bring Carrie, Davies and Nathan Bradberry up, associate and partner for Bevan Brittans, and they will be talking about heat network zoning and the legal opportunities and challenges. So over to Carrie and Nathan.
Thank you very much, Simon. Good morning, everyone. Pleased to be presenting today on heat network zoning, and we're going to be covering some of the challenges we're sort of facing in the market and the potential opportunities that heat zoning, we see that heat zoning is going to bring. I'm conscious we're slightly behind time, so I'll skip over our firm introduction. Needless to say, I'm Nathan Bradberry. For those who haven't met me, I'm a partner at Bevan Brittan, and we're a national legal firm. I'm an energy and construction specialist, and I lead our heat network practice. We provide legal and commercial advice to many of the players involved in heat networks: local authorities, ESCOs, developers, contractors, funders, customers, and even the regulators. So it's just to say we have experience and perspective from all key stakeholders involved in heat networks. So between Carrie and I, we're going to attempt to do a very whistle-stop tour of what we see of some of the challenges and opportunities from a legal and commercial perspective. So I'll kick off and skip through requirements to connect, firstly. Secondly, utilising low-carbon sources of heat. Thirdly, rights and powers. And fourthly, streamlining procurement. And then I'll be handing over to Carrie, who's an associate in our energy team, to cover the last three items there: delivery models, forms of contracts, job skills, and supply chain. So without further ado, the first one, and apologies, we haven't got lots of pretty slides, I'm just going to be leaving this one up on the screen. So the first one, requiring buildings to connect. In our view, and it's probably obvious to everyone involved in the industry, arguably one of the biggest game changers to the success of heat networks that we see from this heat zoning policy. But it isn't easy to get that right. So a planning policy today, actually, in a number of local authorities have already attempted to do that and require connection to heat networks, and for new developments in particular, with varying degrees of success. And as highlighted in the consultation, it's acknowledged there will need to be a joined up approach between heat network zoning and the interface with local plans, and really bringing those two things together. We think this is going to be an area, the requirement to connect, of one of the key legal battlegrounds, really. So where a building developer is concerned about whether the heat network will be built, will it be expanded, will it be a viable connection, will it fit with the developer's programme, concerns over the cost of connection versus cheaper alternatives, that potential kind of resistance from the building developer being concerned about that. Now, if the connection and the use of that heat from the heat network is truly the lowest cost, low carbon heating option for the developer, and importantly, that's an attractive option to the building developer in order for them to satisfy things like building regulation, then the approach will of course work because there's natural incentives on the building developers to do that. You factor in other things like the cost of reinforcement for more localized power-led heating sources, and there's a natural commercial incentive there for building developers. The challenges of course come where that's not the case, and there can be frustration from both building developers and heat network developers seeking to establish and negotiate commercial terms for connection and supply between them. And I think what's really critical with the heat zoning policy coming through and the requirement to connect is that negotiation is not used by building developers to deliberately frustrate a connection. So provided the heat network developer is acting reasonably and within the framework set by the zoning coordinator, it's critical that connection takes place. And that underpins the funding and investment decisions that are going to be made by that heat network developer. So once the requirement to connect is activated by the zone coordinator, the heat network developer and its funder can truly rely upon that is going to be a key central requirement from policy, which we hope will be the case. And from a legal perspective, even where there are those natural commercial incentives that I mentioned for parties to connect and building developers to connect, the issue can be the length of time it takes to finalise a connection and supply agreement to a development. I must say, not just because of the lawyers, by the way, just because of the inherent commercial nature of that arrangement, but the opportunity here for the heat zoning policy is to proactively assist with that and seek to mitigate that risk of connections being frustrated. So we think in the consultation is looking at this, that guidance from the policy, but guidance that's expected to be followed over the commercial terms of connections, perhaps costing methodology to expectations around those sort of charges. Ultimately, enforcement and penalties is going to be key if a party is ultimately frustrating the connection, and standardisation of documentation as the legal and commercial arrangements become more mature. And Carrie's going to touch on some of the former contracts later. And of course, it's going to be significantly helped by broader UK decarbonisation policy on building developers, the things like the Part L building regulation measures, taxation measures, including benefits that incentivise building developers to connect to heat networks. And Arran touched on a few of those earlier. So quickly moving on to the second area, utilising recoverable low carbon sources of heat. So having established confidence in connections and heat demand, equally important aspect of the heat zoning policy will be ensuring that low carbon sources of heat within that zone are equally required to connect. And that proposal to require connection is extremely welcome. The consultation suggested that the obligation to connect at least should only be to high temperature heat sources such as energy from waste plants. And we think it should equally apply to all significant low carbon sources of heat, including data centres, wastewater treatment and so on. And I know from Simon and the UKDEA consultation response, that was one of the asks from the members. So hopefully that's taken into account. So we've got a lot of experience of negotiating heat offtake arrangements, and we can attest to the kind of significant legal and commercial challenges in negotiating those arrangements, particularly where there's not a strong commercial incentive on the heat offtaker, the heat generator, or a planning requirement for them to connect. And even where there is a planning requirement to be offtake ready, query quite a number of times there's not enough scope or detail to actually enforce an offtake arrangement. So the areas of legal and commercial tension we come across tend to be things like price for the heat, the cost and risk over the connection works and timing for supply, minimum capacity and generation, commitments over carbon content, take-or-pay arrangements, liability for interruption or failures to supply, caps on liability. So in a similar vain to the requirement to connect from building developers to a network. Leaving the generator and the heat network developer to agree commercial terms also may result in significant delays and ultimately frustrate the process. And so, again, heat zoning policy could really assist with this, ideally requiring expected key standardised terms around some of those legal and commercial battlegrounds, enforcement and penalties if one party is deemed to be unreasonable. Of course, when setting those standardised terms, it's in itself not straightforward, because of course, you know, the terms that might be applicable to an energy from waste plant in terms of interruption and so on could be quite significantly different from, say, an effluent treatment plant. So that's not a straightforward task, but something that definitely would help mitigate those kind of lengthy negotiations, hopefully. And I guess our general observation is, at the moment, most heat generators will, you know, not be adverse to providing heat, provided it doesn't materially impact upon their business. So, you know, if heat's available, we'll give you heat, but not make any commitments or promises on availability of that heat and potential interruptions. And that makes it incredibly difficult, doesn't it, for a heat network developer to create a business model, accurately forecast the percentage of backup heat they might require, and to meet their specific low carbon network requirements. So again, as with, I think Arran actually specifically mentioned this, there might be other government policy that provides incentives on some generators to connect. So the consultation on the UK emissions trading scheme was one, and the potential for heat network connections, particularly from energy from waste plants, to significantly benefit from that, and potentially offset some of the carbon taxation liability they might otherwise face. So that's all very positive. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there. But yeah, again, significant opportunity for the heat zoning policy to really help with that aspect of requirements for heat generators to connect. So moving on to rights and powers. I'm not going to speak too much about this, but to date, we've been advising local authorities in particular on use of existing legislation. So under things like the Water Industry Act, to try and confer some statutory undertaker rights and powers for installation and maintenance of heat networks. But those options aren't currently available to private sector ESCOs or SPVs, including actually those wholly owned by the local authority. So the proposed licensing arrangements removes another barrier to the delivery of heat network if they are reflected, which is intended in terms of heat network operators having similar statutory undertaker powers to the other utilities is extremely welcome as well. Removes one of the legal headaches and barriers that we tend to come across. And then finally, for my bit, streamlined competitive process to awarding zoning rights. Consultation is quite strong on this, the need to ensure that we don't get long protracted procurement arrangements for the zones. Now, of course, we can't get away from the Procurement Act and the need to ensure compliance with things like procurement law, subsidy control and competition law. But that will be the task of the lawyers and the regulators to make sure that we navigate that path to make it as painless as possible. Everyone will be in the same boat as wanting a smooth, not a protracted procurement process. Use of frameworks might be very helpful in that case. And we envisage that once the heat zoning policy becomes clearer, that there'll be a number of frameworks potentially to be used to aid that speed of procurement and speed of delivery. So that's first four topics. So I'll stop there and I'll hand over to Carrie to cover the other topics of our presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan, and thanks UKDEA for the opportunity. So turning to the focus on commercial delivery models, as Arran mentioned, there are 7 potential delivery models that have been looked at and discussed, and they include things like proactive consent, local authority JV, and concession models. So the growth of the sector through zoning provides a real opportunity to test these models, and recognising the importance of not having a proliferation of models and causing confusion, which Arran mentioned. I think one of the challenges might be not seeing the models as set in stone per se, but rather as guidelines to a type of structure. So ultimately, the delivery approach needs to be tailored to the project and to the parties' approach to risk and reward, as I'm sure you all know. Simon's going to shake his head at this, but one opportunity I would particularly like to see is people getting lawyers involved earlier in the process and seeing us as part of the wider project team from an early stage, so that we're not just brought in to document a deal. We can do that, of course, and we do that. But when we do, it sometimes feels a bit like one of those sort of comedy improvisation shows where we're asked to deliver strictly in the manner of Countdown. So, you know, the scenario, you want an unincorporated JV, but with golden chairs and a concession arrangement. And it becomes a bit difficult because obviously the lawyers start asking questions at that point. So for me, ultimately, it's going to be important to tailor the legal aspects to the specific project and develop a model that works, taking account of the extent that each party can manage its involvement over time in a way that's practical. So, you know, if you don't have a lot of resource to commit to managing contracts, then you don't want a structure that makes it very contract management heavy, for example. So ultimately, the sooner we, as the legal team, are involved, the sooner we can feed into that thinking. And I think the challenge with the changes that are coming and with delivering new networks at pace is going to be ensuring that there's time for the real thinking about appropriate delivery structures. But at the same time, it's a real opportunity to come up with innovative approaches to types of structure, to tailoring existing ones. I mean, we've heard about what the Danes do. You know, they're always looking at different ways of doing things. It's not necessarily one size fits all. And I think that the idea of having of zoning in general is going to lead to that innovation in terms of types of structure, and re-looking at things that we've thought of as being obvious ways of doing things, so that we can ensure that the parties to delivering a heat network get what they want and get what they need to make the network deliver optimally, which is ultimately everyone's goal. Leading on from that, with standardisation of methodology and contract forms, as Nathan mentioned, Simon's going to tell me to hurry up now. We're really strong advocates of standardising and of having standard contract forms, and we note that in the policy this is an ambition. It's a key driver, I think, of success, of minimising cost, of reducing negotiation time. But a key component is going to be the quality of those forms and their flexibility to adapt to the different delivery models, to different heat sources, different approaches. So I've had the privilege to work with various entities in developing standard forms, and one of the advantages, which will be music to Simon's ears, I hope, is that this can lead to automation and reduce the need for legal spend, and it can speed things up. That said, I would say that wholesale development of standard forms that apply across the sector is pretty hard to do well, because each project's different. But I think there is a real opportunity here to start developing banks of clauses and drafting to address key issues. Nathan mentioned some, and there's things like step-in and consumer rights. And I know that we would certainly welcome the opportunity to work with other law firms to share thinking around approaches and see what can be done to advance the approaches to standardisation in the sector, because it's really important. Lastly, and to my mind, actually possibly the most important, as it's a personal interest of mine, is around growth of jobs and skills. UKDEA is doing a lot of really excellent work in this area, and I would definitely encourage you to get involved if you're not already. It's clearly a major area of opportunity, but also it's a huge challenge, including in the legal services sector. So as the government's taking the brakes off the green energy sector, there are going to be skills shortages in the short term, and we all need to be actively thinking about how we reskill existing workforces. How do we encourage school leavers to look at this sector as a place that they want to work? And I think we as a heat network sector need to think that, you know, we're not alone in this, and how do we work with others in the green energy sector, so wind, solar, for example, to look at synergies of the types of skills-based skill sets that we want to develop, and how we maximise the apprenticeship levy. From our side as a firm, we've been really gratified to see how many aspiring lawyers we're meeting when we attend career fairs and vacation schemes, and people applying for our training contracts that have a particular interest in energy law. It's not an area that they learn about at university. It's not an area that a lot of people have heard of as being a thing. But once you tell them, and you tell them what we do, they get really quite excited about it. So I think it's on all of us to look at ways that we can actually engage with people to tell them about how exciting the sector is and how much is happening here, and what a great opportunity it is to work in the heat network sector. So that's all from us for now, but please do put any questions you've got in the chat. And thank you, Simon. Sorry for overrunning.
No worries. Thanks very much indeed to Nathan and Carrie. Much appreciated. Apologies to delegates as we're running behind schedule. That's my fault. Apologies. So next up is Nick Gosling. Nick is the Chief Strategy Officer for Vital Energy. And Nick, we'll give you 15 minutes from now, to be fair. That's only fair. To talk about heat network zoning development challenges, risks and opportunities. So over to you, Nick.
Great. Thank you to the DEA for giving us the opportunity. In 15 minutes, it's impossible to cover all of the challenges, risks and opportunities. So I'll have a fair crack at covering what I think are some of the important priorities. I probably don't need to cover this slide because I think I'm preaching to the converted. Probably everyone on the call knows what heat networks do and why they're important to provide a step change in decarbonisation of heat, create what potentially thousands of skilled jobs, encourage significant private sector investment into the sector in order to deliver in excess of 20% of the UK's heat demand, which is a minimum expectation rather than a target. But all of these things, I think, are at risk if zoning policy doesn't work or doesn't work effectively. So I've taken the opportunity in this presentation to talk about some of the key areas where I see some red flags. And in order to identify where those are, I've done a simple slide, well, hopefully simple, which talks about what does success look like. Clearly, we want pace and scale in the development of heat zones. We want opportunities to be attractive to the supply chain and the various delivery organisations involved, whether they be funders, contractors, design and build providers, etc. But it's also got to be easy for customers to make the choice to connect to heat networks. So some of the things that I think are important that we should do, it's got to be attractive to the private sector. I think it should build on existing infrastructure where this could supply wider customers. And included in that is existing campus networks and existing heat networks, the new name for incumbents, I believe. It needs also, I think, to provide a pathway for zones to be created around that existing infrastructure, which could be in the form of waste heat. And I know that's been discussed a fair bit today already. Some of the things that I think should avoid doing is treating all campus networks as mandated connections. And I'll come back to this because I think treatment of campus networks is a really key policy design point. I think we also should ensure we don't ignore network opportunities outside of designated zones. Again, I'll come back to this one. So going on to looking at how we make the opportunities attractive to delivery organisations, we have to focus on the commercial viability of the networks. And as Nathan and Carrie have said, having a consistent procurement approach undertaken by the procuring authorities. We need to avoid introducing uncertainty relating to mandation of connections and exemptions. Moving on to customers, we want customers to have an easy choice, and by providing clarity of policy on what decarbonisation looks like would make it very easy for them to make the right choice to connect to a low carbon district heating network. And clearly heat and cost of connection need to be affordable and comparative to counterfactual options that those customers might have. But we run a risk of creating different policy requirements inside and outside of heat zones. And again, this is an area I'll come back to shortly. And we need to be careful that we don't have conflicting government support mechanisms that could encourage what we believe is the wrong outcome. So today I'm going to talk about 3 of these key areas that I've identified as red flags. So firstly, around campuses, secondly, around how zones are created, and thirdly, around policy clarity. So first, starting with campus networks. So as I said earlier, I think building around existing infrastructure presents a very significant opportunity for heat network growth and provides a catalyst to decarbonise that existing infrastructure. So I'm talking here about an existing hospital, university, MOD campus, etc., which, taking the diagram on the right, would be the centre of the donut. So we have to avoid a scenario where a town or city has an incumbent network in the middle that has its retained rights, but the area outside of that area becomes a donut shape that is perhaps unviable as a standalone heat zone. But that doesn't need to be a problem if we allow those campus sites or incumbent networks to expand into the zone. Mandating connection to some of the campus sites, particularly those that are under long-term energy performance contracts, and long-term could be anywhere from 15 up to 35-year contract terms, could have very significant negative financial implications on the campus. We've got examples where we're talking many tens of millions of pounds of financial impact by having to cut short an existing energy performance contract. And I believe there could be ways of treating campus networks more akin to the incumbency rules, where we look at proximity and have the ability for campuses to request that a zone is created. And again, I'll come on to this in a moment. Talking about zone creation, could there be a pathway for zones to be created around existing infrastructure? On the right-hand side of the slide, I've explained, and Arran did this much more eloquently than I did earlier, explaining the process for a designation of a zone by DESNZ using the national zoning model, which identifies an area where a heat network can provide the lowest cost form of low carbon heat. A zone coordinator is then created, allowing a zone developer to be procured and appointed, and hence the zone delivered. So that's what I call the top-down approach. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I don't think it works in every scenario. And I think we are missing a huge opportunity if we don't also consider a policy design that allows what I've called bottom-up development. So that could be where a developer identifies a resource, which could, for example, be a waste heat source or existing heat network infrastructure, that they then are permitted to apply to DESNZ for a zone to be created. There then follows a process for the award of the zone, and I've got a couple of slides that talk that through coming up next. Then a zone developer can be appointed and the zone delivered. So in terms of how that might work from a flow diagram perspective, I've referred this to an incumbent submitting a statutory notice requesting the creation of a zone to the central authority. There's various different feedback loops, but if the central authority approves the request for the zone to be created, that can then follow on into a zone awarding process, which can then proceed in this manner, which allows a competed process to be undertaken. There may well be no other bidders other than the or other than the incumbent. If that's the case, then potentially the incumbent can be awarded the zone developer rights. If there are multiple bidders that apply to become the zone developer in that area, then a process can be competed and follow through in the manner proposed. So I don't think this is changing any of the intent in the current policy design. It's just a nuance that will avoid a cliff edge of zone development outside of those areas that are following that top-down designation and zone creation approach. Coming up to my last couple of slides, I talked about clarity of government policy. Currently, the UK is on a pathway to net zero. There is no mandate currently for buildings across the country to achieve net zero by a certain date or stop doing things like putting in gas boilers or using gas boilers. There's certainly some intent through things like the Future Home Standard, etc., and Future Building Standard, but none of that is currently hard law that requires people to do things. As a consequence of that, there is a potential that we end up with different policy requirements for buildings to decarbonise inside and outside of zones. So we create an uneven playing field, if you like. Now, that may well, there may well be temporary measures in which that could be addressed, which would probably require some form of subsidy mechanism to bridge the difference in cost of heat and cost of connection to buildings that are mandated to connect within a heat zone. Now, I've just mentioned here that the Heat Network Industry Council is working on a number of work streams, including skills, which I know Carrie mentioned as a key area of importance, which it is, but also working on things like how to reduce cost of heat and what sort of subsidy mechanism might be required, how to innovate and reduce the cost of installing heat networks. But at the moment, we do face this uneven playing field that will only work if there is either a subsidy mechanism, or moving to my second bullet point, it could well form the basis for buildings to claim exemption from connection within zones, which then is a failure of the mandation and clarity that zoning is intended to provide to developers. So it's missing a fundamental objective of the policy, which then gives developers uncertainty, will make the market more difficult. I won't say less attractive, perhaps it will. So I think this area around policy design, zoning policy, is really critical and really important, but it forms part of a wider policy mandate that DESNZ needs to consider to avoid this creation of uneven playing field. Another sort of policy area that is challenging and has been frustrating is the policy and support mechanisms, for example, the PSDS, supporting public sector buildings to undertake building-specific decarbonisation measures. I know in the latest round of PSDS phase 4, there is a consideration of heat network connection as one of the potential low carbon heating technology options that applicants should consider. But at the moment, it's again, should we do a building specific solution? Should we connect to a heat network? We ideally want policy that directs people in one direction. So if we're in a zone that has been identified as a heat network zone because that's the lowest form of low carbon heat, then PSDS really shouldn't be offered to those buildings. And if it is, it's only permitted for heat network connection. So I think probably, Simon, I've just about met my 15-minute slot. So I'll leave it there and look forward to any challenging questions that you might have. So thank you all.
No, thanks very much indeed, Nick. Much appreciated, and some really interesting observations on challenges and things that need to be addressed in policy. So yeah, that's great. Thank you, Nick. So I invite you to leave the stage and Stephen Hart to come on and finish up for BAXI, and Tom to pull the presentation down. That's super. So Stephen, we'll give you 15 minutes from now. Over to you.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks to UKDEA. I'll try and break the habit of a lifetime and finish inside my allotted 15 minutes. I thought it would be worthwhile us representing sort of the call to arms from the manufacturer, and also give shed some light on the energy transition and what it looks like from being one of the big suppliers of gas burning boilers in the UK market. First of all, BAXI, we're part of the BDR Vermeer Group. BDR Vermeer Group is a European-wide business, about €2.5 billion turnover, about 7,000 staff. And it's really a story of acquisitions and mergers from, believe it or not, the 17th century, making heating and hot water equipment. BAXI itself started trading in the late 1800s. And today, that story of acquisitions and mergers have continued. So although BDR is created in 2009, we're a foundation-owned business. So our foundation business sets what our group board and our operating company boards have to perform. And one of those is to be work towards a sustainable future, both for the planet and both for our business and our employees. So we can see that a couple of notable joining companies to the group in 2021, Hitexa. That is the third of our 4 heat pump companies within the BDR Vermeer Group. We can clearly see that whilst we manufacture currently between 250,000 and 300,000 gas burning boilers currently today on our Preston site in the market, we clearly know that's not going to be occurring in 10 years from now. So managing the energy transition internally is as challenging as we see in the market. But what we do see is that we've brought technologies, experience, and solutions into the group, which we can leverage through the BAXI window to the UK and Irish market. An important acquisition and joining of the group was Fortis Energy Systems. Fortis are a company that specialised in the manufacture of heat interfaces and thermal substations for some years, and they're the market leader in the Netherlands. I personally have worked for a Danish company for 17 years, and I'm well aware of how many of the relevant learnings we've seen coming from those markets. But oftentimes the challenges in the Nordic region, Sweden, Denmark, etc., are about improving energy efficiency and decarbonising energy sources and existing networks, whereas the opportunity and challenge in the UK and the Netherlands are the same. It's to wean us off our addiction to natural gas. Both of us came across natural gas in the late 50s, and as Lars said earlier on, meant that we've been quite comfortable and not really had to worry about that in the past. But we see the fuel security, the net carbon zero challenge really driving that on. So the Netherlands, they tend to be a little bit more of a market share in terms of connected buildings to heat networks, and that's maybe around 14% relative to sort of 2 or 3% we see in the UK. In fact, I think it's about 9% right now in the Netherlands, apologies. But we've seen that rapidly start to change. And so the market for HIUs, for example, in the Netherlands is roughly double the size of the UK. But we see ourselves on the transition, the same pathway. It's just perhaps maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years behind. And that means that some of the lessons that we find in continental Europe are very relevant and are a real sign pointer to what we're going to see. So we know from our perspective that the future of heating hot water, and I'll use cooling as well, just as negative heating for this purpose, we see that as gas is phased out, certainly natural gas, we see the future being certainly very heat pump orientated. We see that throughout Europe. The UK is no different. We see hybrids where we're using perhaps a combination of gas and whether that's natural gas or biogas or perhaps in the longer term hydrogen gas, that does enable the use of gas burning to create the opportunity to use peak to address peak loads without the full cost infrastructure. So although it's not the ideal solution, it certainly may be a gateway technology. Much in the same way that CIBSE CP1 encourages the consideration of hybrid energy centres to use some form of non-fossil or fossil fuel product, just maybe for 10 or 15% of the annual heat. It has a real positive impact in the total capex of the project, and perhaps allows projects to get moving in the short term, whereas perhaps fully electric or full heat pump solution might be prohibitive on capex, challenging the rates of return and the investment. So we don't know, frankly, what the combination of any of these four, whether it be heat pumps, hybrids, hydrogen, importantly heat networks, we know are all going to be, to a lesser or greater degree, in all the markets that we serve, which is global, 100 markets, but generally European focused. They're all going to play a greater or lesser part. And I think that many people have spoken today and before on how heat networks, and in particular heat zoning, is really going to influence what occurs in the UK. So, this, I'm not going to dwell on this slide, apart from really saying what we're seeing, the development of the heat zoning policies really will drive a demand growth for particularly thermal substations in the UK market. And that's why, some of our site in Preston here that we're dedicating to manufacturing thermal substations to connect buildings and for applications in networks, because we see the demand growing from what has been very, very small numbers, not really justifying the investment from a manufacturing point, really starting to be very worthy of something that can, ensure our longevity as the burning of gas phases out and those revenue streams dry up for our business. So thermal substations, really also called a heat interface or a hydraulic interface unit. I tend to use thermal substations above about 50 kilowatts of heat, which often can be mounted in a sort of a pre-insulated wall-hung interface unit, if you like, very similar to what we might see in typical apartments. When you get above that, up to as much as 2-3 megawatts, even 5 megawatts of heating, possibly not in the UK, but certainly, multi-hundreds of kilowatts, these tend to be frame-mounted equipment, allowing substations to sit out in heat networks. Typically, the heart of these are packaged or heat exchangers, and they're allowing the gearing down of pressures and or temperatures, as perhaps some zones require higher temperatures and other zones require less. So let's gear down to lower temperatures whenever and wherever we can. But probably the more frequent use of thermal substations is in building connections, commercial, residential, institutional, to heat networks. So, for example, we here at Preston, we have a manufacturing offsite business, makes packaged plant rooms and the like. We're really pivoting away from the typical independent fabricator, which was kind of the culture of the business. We acquired Packaged Plant Solutions back in 2017, and really using it as a carrier, a delivery mechanism for some of our IP technologies, whether that's air source heat pumps or thermal stores or backup boilers or controls or whatever. We have that going on. Of course, we look to BAXI for generating heat and hot water. That makes sense. But really heat transfer with the arrival of Fortis Energy Systems within the group really has a big impact. So they remain the technical authority, and we can therefore leverage their experience of, I think something like 1,200 thermal substations they've delivered since 2015. Principally in the Netherlands, but also a little bit into the UK at Wembley Park, and also into the wider Benelux and Denmark. So we're drawing on that experience. And the one experience that we know is that in the early years, these have very much been customized, built around a P&ID developed by a consulting engineer that is really drawn up from, a blank piece of paper on every project and every desk, because of course, professional indemnity is a singular thing rather than a firm thing, and it might have every widget and every opportunity, every singing and dancing inside the technology, and that of course can be done, It's certainly being able to make packaged plant rooms. It puts us in the right culture to make these engineered to order thermal substations, but it's very inefficient in terms of resource development, in terms of spending lots of time engineering solutions, which that then goes in the bin, never to be reused again. And really, for us as a manufacturer, one thing we are keen to do is use this increase in appetite for thermal substations to really modularize the approach to manufacturing. And again, we've seen this in the Netherlands. It's probably been a bit easier there. That market tends to be dominated by a handful of energy service companies. And whilst you might develop a particular range of products, maybe from 100 kilowatts to 2 megawatts for a particular ESCO, they might have slightly different needs or desires to their competitor down the road. They do at least want to standardise across multiple projects, and we haven't yet got to that in the UK. And we would really ask that the market really focuses on that, because that allows manufacturers with expertise. We've got some in Fortis, but there are others. Setitherm and Danfoss, of course, are recognised, but there are a whole host of independent fabricators who can take an engineered to order approach, but it's not the way to deliver cost effectively, efficiently, and at this kind of pace that we're going to need. It's important we can manufacture basic sub-assemblies, which we can then bring together much faster. Just this example here is a standard, I think this particular is a DN50 solution. We have those all the way up to DN125, I think, and they just step up depending on the velocity limitation, the pipework set out by CIBSE, etc. But of course, oftentimes in a conventional citywide district heating, you may be connecting a building, particularly a new build, when you don't know what the floor plate is like. You don't know how to size a pump, for example. So oftentimes on a heat network or a district heat network, you would find the thermal substation finishing with just a pair of flanges to be picked up by the main contractor or the M&E subcontractor actually involved with building the buildings. He could size the pump, the pressurization, the expansion. However, one or two times, and Nick was certainly talking about the importance of campus networks. I really agree with him. One of the benefits of campus networks is they do have sight of what is the requirements in terms of pump head and volume for pressurization, expansion, etc. But it's important that we as a manufacturer, we have a base design, much like going to the car dealership. You choose which dealership you want to deal with, which manufacturer brand, Audi or Mercedes or BMW. You're then choosing your model, and only at the back are you choosing the options and accessories. What we need to try and get away from is designing from the ground up every time a new project kicks off, because the supply chain just cannot deliver at the pace that is going to be necessary. So here's a good example. We tend to use brazed plate heat exchangers on thermal substations, tend to pivot more towards gasketed solutions on large energy centres. But nevertheless, this is really a fixed point, a heat exchanger. So there's, this is just a range dedicated from one manufacturer that we do business with, going from the very smallest to the very largest, and choosing the right model will really determine the flow rates and the selection of all the components that then come off of that. But it's really important that we don't mess around and undercook the needs of the heat exchanger itself. It's very keen. If we've got a high return temperature here, we want a 500 kilowatt unit with a return temperature to the system of 60 degrees, even though the secondary side is 20. Our flow rates are very, very high. It has an impact on capex, on pipework, on not just the substations, but all the secondary and primary networks. So we need to be certain that we right size the heat exchangers. Going up to a 40-degree return temperature, we can see that the thermal length, i.e. the amount of the heat exchanger in contact with the two primary and secondary sides of the water, is going up significantly, all the way up to 8-fold or even 16-fold, and the flow rates coming down. And that, having the right approach to heat exchangers may well mean the heat exchanger element is a more expensive choice, but it has real benefits in terms of trying to come up with a standardized set of products, whether it be heat meters, control valves, being able to control a heat exchanger with a high turn down, high differential pressure closure control valve. Those technologies exist now. We want to build them in as a standard. Nobody tells us the components that we put in our floor standing boilers. We need to reach to the same position when we're manufacturing the thermal substations. And yes, you can then compete multiple manufacturers, hopefully including us, but we need to try and stay away from the temptation to put, I don't know, a differential pressure sensor across every filter. Or do we really need an N+1 if we've got clean in place and service valves with and some standby critical spares? Taking some sensible decisions, and don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. As somebody said to me the other day, much better done than perfect. Standardization isn't just mechanical, it's also electrical. There are controllers and other devices on the market that are standardized and specialized for our heat network application. We don't have to spend all that time programming a Honeywell or a Trend or a Siemens controller. These things can literally be chosen with an application key or similar, or dialed in by the user, and we can then tell it whether we've got just heating or heating and hot water, or whether we've got 2 plates or some thermal storage connected. That is all standardized, and it's the standardization that I really encourage. And finally, often the next set of questions we get when we're starting to talk a developer or an asset owner about the plant, the substations, is but who's going to look after this for us? We might have an FM, but this can be seen as specialized equipment. We really think remote monitoring and metering, yes, of course, this is a conduit for our platform can lead to delivering the billing authority and making certain that people pay for the heat they use. But it's far more important in our world that we're able to see what's happening on all those temperature sensors, what's happening on those actuators, what's the pump doing, because that enables us to really monitor what's happening in the system, start to now through on our same platform, be able to match the heat we're generating at the central energy center with what's being connected at the buildings, without the need for a fiberglass network buried with the pipework that, even if it is done, in my experience, isn't ready for the first 3 years of the operation of the network in any case. So a cloud-based heat network system, management system is a really sensible thing, using the latest technology in low power wide area networks or IoT wireless connectivity. And the real reason that we're so keen on that is not that that of course people want to see real-time monitoring, etc. We want to be able to analyze the data to optimize the system and bill the energy, but mostly we want to go and deploy our 270 service engineers to be able to do the remote commissioning, the diagnostics when there's a wrong, and actually when we do need to replace a component, let's do it in a planned way so that reliability isn't the enemy of sustainability and affordability.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks very much, Steve. I think that's pretty much yourself wrapped up there. So that's great. Thanks very much indeed. Tom, if you don't mind putting the slides down, and if I can invite the speakers to come back onto the stage, we'll take questions from the various speakers. So great stuff. Arran, you're there. Arran, you seem to have had most of the questions. I don't want to particularly pick or focus on you, but if there are other questions that people ask, then please do come and ask them now. So there's one from Jeff House, which got 7 ups at 10:25, Arran, if you can see it. So in our consultation response, so this is from Jeff, we raised some concerns over the potential opt-outs and exemption criteria. Can you share any thoughts on this point and the potential impact on zoning impact? Is there any further development on opt-outs or exemptions for people not connecting to heat networks, Arran?
Yeah, of course. I mean, overall, we want that exemptions regime to be as specific and as stringent as possible. The whole aim of zoning is that we're designating areas where heat networks are going to be the best solution for decarbonising space heating and hot water demand of buildings in those areas. And what I would say is we're giving a lot of thought to that area, and a lot of time has been spent within the department trying to tighten up the proposals in the consultation, taking into account the feedback that people have given. We've been really considering a lot of it in detail, as I said, the approach we want to go to is as specific and stringent as possible, supported by really specific guidance as well about when buildings should be, getting an exemption from those requirements to connect. I can't go into too much detail about what exactly that will look like until we publish the government response, or until we have more kind of broader policy arenas to debate where we're going on that. But hopefully that's a useful, sense of where we're going in policy terms.
So I'm taking from that, Arran, that exemption should be the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah, that's definitely how we see it. Yeah.
Good, excellent stuff. Next one up is again for you, Arran, I'm afraid. Simon Davidson, the pilots. So the zoning pilots, and there was talk about publishing those. Do you know when the outcome of those will be published, when the studies will be published, Arran?
I can't give a firm date. We're looking to publish as much information as possible in coordination with the government response this autumn. So yeah, I think keep a lookout for that then.
Okay, so you think the pilots should be published in autumn, the details of what took place in the pilots. Okay, the next one up is from Hen Cook. So timescale really for heat network legislation and zoning legislation. How are the two timescales working in terms of zoning and regulating the sector?
Yeah, we expect them to come in kind of simultaneously. Heat network regulation should come in together with heat network zoning, either in the same year or very close to them, and that would be the best approach to ensure that we're getting both protections for consumers and also ensuring that we're supporting the rollout of heat network zoning, and people are convinced that they should develop heat network zones in their local areas, and that buildings are confident that they are being connected to the best systems. So we've publicly said it's 2025 for some elements of heat network regulation from Ofgem, and 2025 for launch of heat network zoning.
Okay, so 2025 for both. Good. Okay. The next one up is quite an intriguing one from Jonathan Williams. Arran, again, sorry for one for you. GB Energy and its interaction with heat network zoning in the private sector delivery model that was pursued prior to the election. Any thoughts on either a change in direction in the delivery model, or the interaction of GB Energy with heat networks?
So I think it's a watch this space on any potential specific role for GB Energy in heat network zoning. As you'd imagine, ministers are considering lots of different things about the role of GB Energy across the UK energy landscape, and you can certainly imagine lots of exciting possibilities for in the role for GB Energy. But as I say, it's a more watch this space. In relation to what it signals about the ambitions for investment from the new government, we haven't got into those level of detail with new ministers yet, unfortunately. But what I would say is that it seems very unlikely that the big picture message would change, especially when you consider the public statements from the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, and our new Secretary of State, Bevan, during the election, where they talked continuously about the importance of bringing in private sector investments to deliver net zero. I would not expect the broad picture on that position to change under this government.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much for that. And there's another one from Andrew Horsfield. It's more of a statement than a question, but I'll open this up to anybody who's got any thoughts on this. So to meet the demand of heat networks, there needs to be a massive drive on recruitment. Otherwise, how can the current heat network developers deliver all the demand? This is a big risk. Maybe one for you to kick off with, Arran, but if anybody else has got any thoughts on recruitment and skills gap and how we increase the capacity of the sector, and any thoughts on what work that DESNZ is doing on that point, Arran?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think I would point to our heat training grants, which certainly UKDEA has helped us advertise, to try and increase the level of training in the sector. But even we acknowledge that would not be enough to meet the ramp up in demand that we envisage under heat network zoning. And again, look out for further announcements as part of the spending review and any new announcements this autumn as part of zoning on further support that the government would make to transition and support the kind of green transition for skills and training. What I would say in terms of zoning policy is that we have talked about in the consultation how the Central Zoning Authority, which will be a team within the department, will be publishing periodically a pipeline of investment opportunities, and how the Central Zoning Authority will be responsible for ensuring that that there's good foresight for the investment sector and the economic development sector of opportunities coming up across England, so that it's not just all zones go live all at the same time. There will be a massive ramp up in demand, but you should expect to have visibility of that growth in the sector, and of course we're planning to start that with sharing more information about the AZP cities soon as part of our government response, but then also once zoning goes live, making sure there's a clear pipeline of investment opportunities so that the sector can understand what the ramp up in demand is likely to look like and have confidence in investing in training and skills as well.
Okay, no, great, thanks very much. I'm conscious Nick's got his hand up on this one. Shall I bring you in, Nick?
Yeah, thank you. As part of our involvement in the Heat Network Industry Council, a new group has been formed to focus on skills development, etc., which I've been given the joy of leading. So there is a piece of work that is about to launch that's looking at the whole issue of skills. On my slides, I mentioned 35,000 skilled jobs need to be created, which I think resulted from a piece of work I did a couple of years ago. But there is still uncertainty about exactly the pace, and particularly, as Arran just mentioned, the growth rate that we need to achieve in order to hit the zoning programme ambitions that government has set out. So we know that we've got a shortage of skills. We don't know exactly in what disciplines those shortages are going to be most apparent. My guess is it's across the board. It's welders, it's designers, it's legal advisors, it's commercial advisors, etc. So one of the very first pieces of work that I'm proposing to do as part of the work stream is actually do a map of all the skills needed across the whole of the sector, in order to try and identify the different pathways that could be taken to develop those skills in those different disciplines. Now, although it's a Heat Network Industry Council-led initiative, as the leader of that group, I'm very happy to have involvement and contribution from people that aren't involved day-to-day in the Heat Network Industry Council. So if there's any of the people on the call that feel that they would like to contribute and be part of that process, then I don't see why I can't make that offer today. So please get in touch with me if you like through Simon. If you feel you've got a voice that can contribute to the challenge that we face as a whole sector, then please get involved. It's an important time now to make a difference. So thanks, everyone.
Brilliant. No, thanks very much, Nick. Much appreciated. I'm conscious Steve's got his hand up. Steve Hart.
Just really to make a sort of an optimistic comment, really. I mean, I'm an engineer at Hart. I walk around talking around technology all the time. But certainly since I've been representing BAXI in the world of heat networks, it is noticeable how many stakeholders are far more interested in the fact that we train 7,000 heating engineers a year than the fact that we can deliver another widget. And we're finding, ourselves, our competitors, ourselves and Worcester Bosch, for example, our training facilities are now being used to deliver the practical elements of the stage 2 of the BESA training scheme. I think we've got 3 main training centres, another 13 in further education colleges. Our competitors in the boiler field are the same, and we're starting to see the appetite for training in heat pumps really starting to ramp up, and we're seeing a similar appetite in heat networks. So it may well be it's reskilling the existing workforce using the existing assets as the natural load for training up boiler installers drops off. I think there's a hidden infrastructure that could be brought to bear here.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point. Thanks very much indeed. I'm conscious of time. Lars, Gus asked a specific question whether you believe that 20% of the UK's heat ambition could actually support investment at the scale you described without bursting the public purse. I mean, from Arran's perspective, he's talked a lot about bringing in private sector finance, but have you only thought about how the scale of this ambition could be delivered in terms of funding or financing? Any thoughts or comments in response to Gus's questions?
Yeah, I think the way the Danes did it is anything with economics. If waste heat is obviously the cost of waste heat is very, very low, so always go for the lowest cost heat, and then that has a big impact in terms of financing things. So the cheaper the heat and the better the infrastructure. So that's how it's going to be driven. That you've got to go for the cheap heat, and therefore everyone then has an interest in it. So that's the economics. That's the strange thing in the UK is the power stations are allowed to keep dumping heat to atmosphere. But people are having to pay quite a lot for their heat, and so that's the way to think about it. Go for the cheap. It's just economics, just simply economics. But obviously, it's going to cost. It's going to cost someone somehow to do it. But there is a cost in terms of continuing to use fossil fuels. So how exactly is that going to do? Or are we saying that we don't go to net zero and therefore we slide that? That's the alternative, is that we give up on net zero because it's just. And how difficult is it to dig trenches and put pipe into the ground?
Yeah, no, thanks very much. I mean, I think there is a distinct connection in my mind, Arran, between Lars's presentation and GB Energy, because somebody's got to unlock those very hard to grasp big centralised heat sources that are miles from central as a population. And as I said in my response to what Lars said, there was a previous report done by the Institute of Civil Engineers that said there's enough heat wasted in the UK to heat all the homes and businesses. It's simply that nobody's ever found a way of successfully getting that waste heat. So thanks for that, Lars. A final question from Steve at the top there. 5th generation district heating networks. Any speakers got a particular thought or comment on the applicability of 5th generation heat networks versus higher temperature heat networks in heat zones? Would anybody like to respond to that one at all? Maybe
me to have a go.
Nick, please do.
I think they play an important role, particularly in urban centres where there's also cooling demand. If there's a way of essentially recovering the waste heat from the cooling going into the buildings within that urban centre and recycling that into heat, brilliant. I don't think anyone has a view, well, certainly from my perspective, that district heating is of one flavour or type. I think every different technology has its place and its role. So there we go. There's my stuff.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good response, Nick. Thanks very much. And just to flag up for you in the chat, David Walton, Sibsey Heat Network Group, be interested in your skills group in Heat Nick, if you haven't seen that in the chat, Nick.
Okay, I haven't. Thank you. I'll pick that up.
That's very good. No, thanks very much indeed. And I'm delighted to say that we've reached 1 minute to the end of our planned event, and so we can finish on time. So I'd like to say a big thanks to all of the speakers today. It was really great for you to come and talk and respond to questions where you've been asked. So thanks very much. Thanks very much for all your delegates, and we can bring the event to a close. So thanks very much indeed.
Cheers, Simon.
Thanks very much. Take care. Cheers. Thank you.